Hello, YouTube land. This is Brenton Sawin coming to you from Lexington, Kentucky, the Bluegrass State. And you're watching Brenton Sawin Mysteries to Search. We've been covering the dog man and Bigfoot topic here quite a bit lately. And we've had some interesting stories, and I get interesting stories on the daily. I have some really cool stuff coming up in the near future. Stories that just are mind-blowing. It's just so amazing, and I'm so thankful that people will share with me and trust me with their stories too. And having said that, I had someone contact me last night, or maybe it was early this morning. I just saw the email today, and I just had to talk to this guy because I heard him before, and if he wants to share where and all that, that's fine with me. But we're going to go by Q because many times this topic, as you know, is a controversial topic and people get ridiculed and things like that. I'm also going to disable the comments for this video, so don't even attempt to try to make a comment. After the Diane video, I think that I can see why someone may want the comments disabled, just so they don't have the ridicule and what have you. If the guest says it's okay to turn the comments on, I will. If not, then we'll even disable them. If you have something that you want to tell me, then you can email me at brentonsawin@gmail.com. It's not hard to make a comment, but most of the time, my regulars, they know how to get a hold of me, and anybody else, I'm sorry if you do want to voice your opinion, but you can do that on other videos I got. Go there and comment about this video if you want. But anyway, without further ado, we have Q on the line, and that's what we're going to go by. If he wants to share any more information about himself, he's welcome to do so. And he is coming to us from northwest Mississippi. Now, in Mississippi, very interesting concept on the Bigfoot dogman phenomenon. And they have a different take on it. And soon I hope to have Kumbo and Bear on, and I think they come from the same neck of the woods, and they'll hopefully, if they do come on the show, we'll hear some more about that. But this guest right here is a fascinating guest with some extraordinary encounters. I did talk to his mother, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying so. And his mother is a fascinating person, and some of the things she told me, she said I can write them down. As of now, she doesn't want to come on the show, but oh my goodness, the things that she said were extraordinary, and I think that it could benefit a lot of people to hear some of the things that she had to offer and the things that she told me. I learned from the guest. That's how I've learned about this topic. Well, I hope that you all can welcome our guest today, Q. How you doing, Q? And welcome to the show.
Hey, I'm all right. Thank you for having me.
Man, thank you for coming on, man, and sharing your encounters and sharing what you know about the topic. Now,
oh, no problem. Thank you for the kind words. And yeah, my mom, man, she's an awesome person. She's really cool.
Yeah, she is, dude. I'm talking about she's so cool. I would. Dude, I'm telling you what, I would almost pay her to come on the show if she would take a bribe, you know.
She'd probably take
it. Yeah, I mean, she had some cool things to say, and I'm not kidding. It was amazing. The whole time I was listening to her, I was thinking, oh my gosh, man, this would be so cool for the audience to hear the information that she was, giving me, and a lot of it was about you. And the encounters that she had in the area that you live, and some of it even crossed over into the things that I know that you had talked about before with the horses and all that kind of stuff. But if you would, man, let's talk about to start out with like your background, your grandfather, the area you live, and what they used to call Bigfoot and things like that in your area, and let's just kind of start there if you would.
Okay, well, growing up, I was very close to my great grandparents. My great grandfather. Me and him were very close. He was my kind of my father figure growing up, and so from the time I was about 6 or 7 years old, I spent a lot of time with him, and he operated and owned a gravel company, and so a lot of times I would go on these trips with him. And he owned his own gravel pit, but a lot of times he would often go, and I guess it wasn't necessarily considered networking, but he would go to different areas of Mississippi. And these gravel pits, they were always around like heavily forested land and that sort of thing. But him and my grandmother, they would talk about these creatures called catamounts. And if you were to go and actually Google the word, in the present time, the word catamount seems to represent cougars. But I can promise everybody that during like the 30s and the 40s, up until like the coming of age with the internet, catamounts are what they refer. That's what they actually called Sasquatches. And so I would hear them talk about these things called catamounts, and they never said that, okay, this is like a two-legged hairy man thing or anything like that. They would just generally talk about, like, when they were younger, they would hear these things coming to the wood lines of the fields. This is like an age when people, they grew their own vegetables and they raised a lot of their own food. And they would have to go out and work in fields and things like that. And they said that these creatures would come out, these catamount things would come out at the wood lines, and they would scream at them. And they would say, you never want to meet one. And that was the thing. And, I always mention this story. There was like a particular time I wanted to go with my great-grandfather to some gravel pit that was somewhere in Mississippi. And I guess I was probably around 7 years old or something like that. And, my great-grandfather says, well, I'm going to take, he was going to take me out to this area, and he was just telling my grandmother where we were going to go. And she's like, no, you don't need to take him out there. She's like, if you take your eyes off of him, she's like, one of those catamounts is going to come out of the wood line and is going to snatch him. And my grandfather was like a really tough guy. I mean, he would have been in like probably his early 70s at that point in time, and he was a tough old dude. I mean, like the first physical altercation I ever witnessed in my life was my grandfather, right? And he beat up a younger guy that was so much younger than him, and I was like, I just remember being a kid and being like, oh. But he was one of these people. I don't think that he was overly superstitious, but I mean, he just was not scared of anything. And I remember when they would talk about those catamount things, that like he would just get this look in his face, and it would just be like he'd seen a ghost or something like that,
Right.
And so then, like something that tends to happen a lot of time with your grandparents, as you tend to get a little bit older, your connection with them tends to thin a little bit, you know what I mean? You end up going on, you kind of end up having your own set of friends, and you kind of end up doing your own things as you get a little bit older.
Right.
So they basically passed away the summer before I had my first encounter. And my grandmother first passed away, and then my great-grandfather passed away, right behind her. Okay, so other than that, growing up, there's been like a few Bigfoot shows that I'd seen. Like, for example, I had seen In Search Of back in the day, and I'd seen the Patterson footage. And like a lot of people during that time, like the Patterson footage was not stabilized. And you were just basically seeing like the flip-flop version of, like Patty. And like the camera, like I say, it wasn't stabilized. So you really couldn't make heads and tails of what you were actually looking at. And of course, like I'd seen Boggy Creek, I think about maybe 2 or 3 times. And the funny thing about Boggy Creek is when I remember like seeing it as a kid, it was almost more comedic than it was a horror movie to me at that point in time.
I don't mean to cut you off, man, but I watched all of the Boggy Creek videos this weekend. I had myself my own little kind of slumber party with the Bigfoot, marathon. Yeah. It was so awesome, man. I enjoyed it so much. It's fascinating to watch how they covered the topic and the progression of it and the direction they actually went with the topic. The first one, I think, covered it more like it is. And then they progressively tried to get politically correct, with Bigfoot, not offend it, So anyway, I'm sorry, man. Go ahead.
If you actually watch Boggy Creek, it only makes a mention of Sasquatch in the film about once, towards about the end of the movie. It doesn't really say that, okay, this was a Bigfoot type creature, you know?
Right.
And I remember watching as a kid, and I just remember thinking, okay, there's a hairy man out in the woods, you know? And I mean, you know, like we kind of heard about the subject, but like when you heard about like Sasquatch or Bigfoot, it was always related to, you know, like California and the northwest of the United States and Canada and places like
Right.
that. And you know, it's like I've said before, you just didn't hear about these creatures being in the South.
Right.
And you know, even though my great grandparents talked about these creatures called catamounts, we never knew what they were really talking about, you know. And then
Yeah.
they wouldn't talk about it, say like it wasn't like an everyday subject with them, but they
Did they call them
talked
boogers
about it.
also?
No, they did not. They just simply referred to them as catamounts.
What about no heads?
No, none of that.
Yeah. Well, I guess it depends on where you're from, but those are some terms from that area. In your particular area, you just heard them as catamounts.
Yeah, and
Okay.
but I mean,
Cool.
but you would have never known what they were talking about. I mean, they never said, okay, well, this is like something that walks on two legs, or this is something that might look a little bit humanoid, or anything like that, you know?
Right.
And so, I mean, I think basically I'd kind of seen like the same films that anybody would have, you know, during like like the early '80s to like the late '80s and that sort of thing. And of course, you know, like I saw like Harry and the Hendersons, and you know, like what I call those kind of silly films, which they make Bigfoot out to be this Care Bear that's a vegetarian, you know.
Yeah.
And so my first encounter, it basically happened to me when I was like 14 years old, and I guess this would have been 1993 going into 1994. And you know, I've done a show before where I've actually talked about these encounters, and you know, I'm not sure how much time we'll have here, but I'll just kind of skim through it. And
As much time as you want. Just put it that way.
Awesome.
All right.
And well, I'll get into a slightly longer version of the story,
Yeah.
because it will kind of add in some details as to why I was in the area that I was in this particular day when all this sort of thing happened.
Right. Leave no detail out, man. I'm serious. This is a show for searching mysteries. I can determine how long any show is, and I have a great respect for you, man. You tell what you think needs to be told, and I will give you the floor on that. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, when I used to go, like what it was is my uncle had bought like he bought some government land towards the center of Mississippi, and I was late into the age of 12. And so like I started going out to the property. I actually didn't start hunting there until I was like about 13 years old. And you know, like I'm one of these people. I support people who hunt, but I also support those people who don't believe in harming animals. Okay, so like I always like to mention that. And in the current day, I do not hunt and I do not harm animals. I actually take in dogs from time to time that are strays, and I actually give them home. So, you know, a lot of times, like when you mention hunting, it makes that right off the bat, it makes people question what you're like as a person, you know. But growing up, it was expected of me to be a hunter, because a lot of my family were like what you call religious hunters and stuff, you know. And so, like, it was just like a rite of passage that when you hit a certain age, okay, you're going out in the woods, boy, and you're going hunting, you know. But, like, you know, like, basically, I used to mess with a lot of firearms when I was young, and I was taught how to professionally shoot a gun. You know, by the time I was 9 years old, I could actually shoot a pistol, and I'd gotten, like, a 12-gauge rifle one of the times, but I was, like, 10 or 11 years old. And so I was schooled in how to use the firearm. Okay, so growing up, you know, I was taught how to use a firearm professionally. You know, like upon going out in the woods, like you know, me and my family, we didn't just go out and we just didn't open fire on anything. And so, like for me, when I was going to deer camp and stuff like that, what it is, I would just kind of go to get out of the house. You know, like I would go out there and like my uncles, they would let me, you know, go and target practice with their high power rifles. You know, nothing automatic or anything like that, but like I became very familiar with a lot of, you know, higher power rifles. And then like I had an uncle that would often at times bring like an extra 3-wheeler down there. So you know, as a kid, that's like a lot of fun. You get to go in the woods and you know you get to go full blast in the woods on a 3-wheeler. You know, so I mean like I would have a lot of fun when I would go down there. Okay, so you know, finally kind of tying into like my first encounter. You know, I didn't really just bring this up on the first show that I did. And to this day, I can't really prove that it was Bigfoot that kind of did these things. You know what I mean? But there were two things that happened before I had this encounter. The year before, it was deer season, and I'd actually shot my first buck. And generally, when I would go hunting and stuff like that, I would only be, not too far out of the way of camp. I would always be close enough that, like, if I got bored, if I didn't see anything, I could walk home. And so, like, the rest of my uncles, they were going much further down the way than I was, And this property had been very heavily forested. And so, like, when my uncle first bought it, he had purchased a bulldozer. So a lot of the trails that were out there, they had to be made, you know what I mean? And so, like, there was more forested land than there would have been, like, open land or anything like that, Okay, so the first year that I really went hunting down there, I was not too far away from my camp. I'd say that I was probably about 3 miles away from where our camp area was. And basically, my dad, at this particular time, he would have had a stand. Had I walked out about, like 15 or 20 feet away, I would have been able to see him. And, being that young, they didn't stick me out in the woods just completely by myself and on my own. I always had someone really close to me.
Right.
We kind of had, like, some ground rules, like I guess most people do when they go hunting. They would tell me, like, they would teach me things like what a four-legged animal sounds like when it would walk through the woods. They would tell me that, hey, if you ever shoot a deer, stay in your tree, don't come down, because they say the most vicious animal can sometimes be a deer when it's wounded. They will attack you. So I was taught, like, anytime you fire that rifle, stay in a tree until someone gets to you. Okay, so that particular day, what it was is I was sitting there, and I'd been out there for about an hour or so, and I heard a deer running through the woods. And, like, the way it is like he would always make sure that you were going to see a buck, and it wasn't a doe, and you accidentally shot a doe. And I had actually seen deer there before, but a lot of times they would be these really small bucks that were just in, like, the beginning of their life, and I didn't shoot them just because I felt like they deserved, like, a chance at their life. You know what I mean? And then, like, I would see does and I would see younger deer, but there wasn't anything, in other words, that was really just on my agenda in terms of, like, okay, this is what I need to take out. But as silly as it was, my ideology at that age was I want to go out there and I want to get the biggest buck I can. I want to get the biggest trophy buck, and then I'm going to retire from this.
Right.
And so basically what it was is I heard a deer that was basically running through the woods, and I was kind of, like, right off from one of the trails we had blazed, and there was, like, a really small game trail, and I would have been about 10 feet off away from the road. And I heard this deer. I mean, I knew that's what it was. You could absolutely, you learn to tell by the weight of something what it is, what kind of animal it is, and you learn to, over time, you learn how to distinguish something heavy or, something that sounds like it's the size of a human. So I just knew it was a deer. And sure enough, it was a deer. But something, I found odd about it is, like, a lot of times the away stuff we had, then it didn't work. A deer could smell you. If they smell you, they're going to run the complete opposite way. But this deer that day, I mean, it seemed like it was almost in a bit of a panic, so to speak. And when that thing came across the game trail, what it was is, like, I had a bunch of trees right in front of me, and so I didn't really have, like, necessarily a clear shot at it. And that particular day, I was hunting with my .22 rifle, which is commonly what I hunted with. And when I got a clear shot at the deer, I ended up shooting it. And I mean, funny at this time, I felt bad that I shot the deer. After I did, I'm like, oh, I shouldn't have done this. And then I really regretted it when I had to gut it later. The smell was awful. But the weird thing about that particular deer hunting experience was that deer that day had been running towards the south. Okay, so, like, that deer ends up going over a hill, and I lost sight of it, right? And so I waited for my dad to show up, and when he came to my stand, I ended up going and getting down from the stand, and we ended up, like, trying to track the deer. All right, so we found a little ways of, like, the trail that it just kind of made as it's been shot. But then, like, where you think that this deer would have fallen, we couldn't find this deer. And I mean, we went and looked everywhere for this thing, and I mean, it was like, not to say that it had magically disappeared, but it had just gotten completely out of radar. And so I don't remember how long we were actually looking for the deer. I'd say about, going into about 20 minutes or so. I had an uncle that we jokingly called the sleeper. And we called him the sleeper because a lot of times when he would go hunting, we think that he was actually out sleeping in a stand. You know, he wasn't hunting; he was going out there to sleep. So we called him the sleeper.
Yeah.
And so my uncle, I mean, he was a really good guy. He had a great sense of humor. He pulls up on his three-wheeler and says, "Hey, are y'all missing something by any chance?" So oddly enough, the deer that I had shot, it was actually, though it was like, you know, running hard to the south, he ended up finding that deer that was like in the complete opposite direction and was right off one of the trails in a bit of a small gully. So we all went and we found the deer, and what was odd about it was how the deer had been laid down. I mean, it was almost unnatural because we couldn't see any tracks of how it like where it would have collapsed and fallen or anything like that.
Right.
And what I'm insinuating is something had picked that deer up, probably heard my uncle coming, and put it on the ground. And that's the impression that you would have got. This thing was just perfectly laid out. I mean, not to say that it was just super weird, but it all boggled us. We were like, okay, how did this deer run south? And now it's way over here in this direction. It's laying down like this, right?
Right.
Okay, so then what happens is we just didn't think anything was supernatural about it or anything was just too off. We just said, okay, there's a good chance that this just probably happened. And so, like, for like almost going into like the next season, my family, they would joke with me, right? They were like, aha, you know, you lost your deer or whatever, you know. And so the summer before deer season opened, what it is, we would go out to these lands with a bulldozer, and we would go out and we would actually blaze trails, and we would make sure that they, you know, like these trails were level, that we would be able to get back there, because a lot of times, like, the rains and that sort of thing would wash out a lot of these trails, you know. And so we would go out there, and like they would plant ryegrass during certain times of the year as well on like the open part of the property where the deer they would come out and they would eat. And so like the particular summer, I went out there and when they were blazing trails and stuff, and my uncle had bought a spare three-wheeler, and so I was kind of tagging along behind everybody. And the day my encounter happened, this would have actually been the area that my dad would have been in. We came into this clearing. And I remember there was like this row of small little fir trees. I don't remember if they were like pine trees or anything like that. But I remember what was odd about it. There was this row of trees, and there was about two of them that had been snapped. And like it had been snapped, and like the bark had been slightly twisted around. And I said, that's weird. I said, you know, why are those trees twisted like that? And I said, why are these bigger trees around the trees not broken, you know?
Right.
And they were like, oh, that's just a storm or whatever. And again, you know, like I knew nothing about this stuff, but like it just struck me as odd why there was these two little trees out of a patch that were snapped and twisted, and you had all these other trees that weren't much bigger and nothing was wrong with them. I mean,
Wow.
if it had been a storm, how come the rest of these trees weren't like snapped and twisted, right?
Right. Huh.
Okay, so then what happens is like I didn't do the bow hunting thing, so I would go during like, you know, like the first week of rifle season that was coming up. Okay, so like we went there, and you know, I don't remember the exact date, but I do remember that it was on a Saturday. It was on a Friday, the first day we arrived. And I had like my few spots, and like I say, I would go out to these places where like if I got bored or if I didn't see anything, I wasn't far enough away from camp. But you know, my entire life that I'd be going out into the woods, I never had that feeling like, oh, you need to be looking over your shoulder. I never had like the feeling like, oh, you're being watched. I never felt like, in other words, there was something out there with me. None of that. I was just
Right.
not afraid of the woods whatsoever, you know. And I remember being a kid, you know, I always joke about, you know, like you would have people that just would get the EBGBs when they would walk in the woods. They would hear a frog hop, and they'd be like, oh, man, let's get out of here right now, you know. What is that? It's Freddy Krueger, you know. And so I mean, like I just wasn't like scared of the woods at all. And you know, like in talking about like some of the shows I've seen, like I mean, it would be something that you would see on TV, and you would just go right about living. You wouldn't put too much emphasis or thought, okay, does this thing exist? Does it not? And again, you didn't hear about these things being in the South. All right, so the first day I was there, I didn't see any deer or anything like that. My uncle starts telling me, he's like, you know, you're never going to see anything if you don't go further out in the woods. And he's like, you're not going to hit anything with that little 22 rifle, you know, because the year before when I actually shot that deer was with my 22.
Right.
And it barely did anything to it, you know. So he's like, tomorrow what we're going to do is we're going to go and we're going to put you way on the back of the property, back there where the open part of the land was. So we're talking about 7 or 8 miles away from camp. And he's like, I'm going to let you borrow my rifle. And, you know, I know someone gave me like some beef because they were like, well, he doesn't even remember what kind of gun he had. But you got to think, man, I'm like in my mid-30s now. And this would have been like 20 years ago. You know, like I used to have birthday parties and I would have ice cream, right? I can't even tell you sometimes what kind of ice cream I would have. But does that mean I didn't have a birthday party? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I'm 90% certain that the rifle that I had that day was a 30-06. I mean, it was a high-powered rifle. I mean, my uncle basically would keep 2 and 3 extra rifles around, and so he was like, okay, I'm going to let you use my rifle. And I remember it had a scope, and I remember I was using hollow point bullets. Okay, so what ends up happening is like they planned to put me out in this deer stand that was like basically you could say about 10 or 15 feet within like a tree line. You know, the key word being tree line, right? And so what it was is I actually got up a lot earlier than I had been. Usually I have to get up about 5 a.m. or stuff. So it was Saturday, and I got up, and like I checked all my gear. I was one of these people. I was very self-conscious about making sure I had everything that I was supposed to have when I would go hunting. So I checked my gear several times. And as we were going out the door, I remember it was 4:35 a.m. That's what time it was. And so my dad back in that particular time had this really loud, I think it was like an early to mid-'80s kind of Kawasaki three-wheeler. And I mean, you could hear that thing coming from like, you know, almost a mile away, you know.
Yeah.
And so we made very, very good time actually getting out to this particular spot that was about 7 or 8 miles away. And when we got out there, man, I mean, it was like pitch black, you know. And so basically what it is, my dad, he didn't speak to me. He drops me off at the stand. I checked my gear about 1 or 2 more times to make sure I had everything I was supposed to have. And then he went over to his stand, which would have been the area where I saw these broken trees the year before. And so I'd say he was probably about a third of a mile, maybe, you know, a little bit of a quarter mile away. But, you know, still, he was close enough that, like, when he went and you know, basically cut the three-wheeler off, I could still hear it, you know.
Right.
Okay, so, you know, upon getting out there that morning, I mean, you get used to being out in this dark setting, and it's always, the woods are a little bit creepy in the morning, so I wasn't bothered by that. But, you know, not too long after I got out there, I mean, it just felt like there was this nasty, just negative, heavy energy around me, you know? And I can't say I felt like I was being watched. I just felt this, what do you call it, like just a bit of a negative energy, right?
Right.
And I mean, something just didn't feel right. And it was the first time in my life that I'd ever been in the woods and actually it felt like this. Okay, so grant me that I didn't have a watch on, so I can't give you exact times of like things that were happening in between and how much time was going by. But I guess my dad had probably been in his spot for about 10 or 15 minutes. And it's like pitch black. And across the field from me, basically I would have been like a tree line, right? So like the area in front of me, it was a little bit of a clearing and an open area. There was this gigantic oak tree about 35 yards away from me. So if I looked over to my right, it was a big open field. And that field sometimes would be like about, you know, 75 to 100 yards from tree line to tree line. And in some cases, it would widen out to be about like a mile. And my uncle, I mean, he probably had closer to 1,000 acres than 500, you know. And I've never been back to this place ever since this happened, and I have no intentions of going back. So about 10 or 15 minutes into it, I started hearing something that sounded like what I call people doing construction work. I mean, I started hearing something, it was banging. It sounded like someone banging a log against a tree. And, I mean, it was just bang, 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 bang. And, you know, like I've mentioned before, it sounds like, you know, you hear people talk about Morse code. But what I heard was not rhythmic. And I guess what was unnerving about it was just how loud it was, right? I mean, it didn't sound like the volume of someone that could be able to hit that hard from that kind of a distance. And by this point in time, I mean, like I'd helped like with construction work and stuff like that, so I knew what a metal on metal sound was. I knew what a metal on wood sound was, and this was wood hitting wood. And I mean, this stuff went on for quite some little time. I mean, like it was probably like 10 minutes. I would just hear something go bang, 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 bang. And it would hit about, I guess about 5, you know, to at least about like a half dozen times, but it was always under a dozen times. And upon hearing it, sometimes it would stop for just a few moments, and then sometimes it would stop for a few minutes. So this stuff goes on, and I just immediately thought, okay, I used the words whacked out country people or crazy hillbillies in the past, but I would just say that I thought we had some people that were trespassing on my uncle's land because most of these people were about like 15, miles away. I mean, who would be out in the woods at this time of the morning playing a prank on somebody? Why would somebody be out there? And then we always heard stories about people who were poachers, and they would assume shoot you, then had to pay some kind of fee for getting caught and have their hunting, rights taken away, And, a lot of people can't stomach that there's people in this world that do things like that, but there are,
Right.
And so I was already a little bit nervous thinking, okay, well, we've got some trespassers out here. And I guess about 20 minutes had gone by, and the knocking had stopped. And so I'm like, okay, well, maybe these people have gone. And I mean, I was like really nervous being out here and hearing this because I was alone, and then people always talk about, well, you had a rifle with you and stuff. And I mean, sometimes, just being a kid, that didn't feel like enough, you know what I mean? I didn't know that people could maybe see me or what,
Right.
So then what happens, I don't remember how far ahead of me it was, but I started hearing something walking on 2 feet. And when I first heard it, it was in the distance, but it was close enough I could hear it just going. And I started hearing like branches and stuff snap and pop. And as silly as it sounds, I thought it was a wild turkey because one of the first years that I went down there, I actually had an experience with a turkey where I could actually see this thing coming at me. And it was walking towards me. I didn't know they were territorial. They'll get after you and stuff. A lot of people don't know that, but like a turkey makes like a Thanksgiving turkey look like a KFC dinner. And in terms of like what a wild one looks like from like the Thanksgiving turkeys that we have every year. And like the turkey that I witnessed before, it was actually jumping in like these trees that were about 5 or 6, feet tall, and was jumping on these branches, and the weight of the turkey was causing them to snap. So that's why I thought at first it was a wild turkey.
Right.
And the steps were not very heavy when I first heard them. And that day when I went out there was a light breeze, but I mean, it wasn't a big enough wind that it was blowing leaves all over the place or anything like that. I mean, you could hear a pin drop. And so I said, okay. I said, maybe there's a wild turkey out here or something like that, And I wasn't just getting freaked out. All right, so then these steps, they would stop, and then you'd hear, someone walking through the leaves.
Right.
Well, it kind of became unnerving because I started hearing these steps. They started walking downhill. And when I heard these steps start walking downhill, all of a sudden they sounded a lot heavier. I mean, you could say the size of like a very heavy human being. And I said, oh man, I started thinking, oh God, there's somebody out here. And basically this thing, when I heard it walking downhill, it had to walk back uphill because we were not like, the field beside me was kind of flat land, but the particular area I was in,
right.
You've heard the saying from the delta to the hills. And so you have a lot of, slopes and just hill, like the land is just covered in hills and little gullies and ditches and things like that. So when that thing walked up the hill, basically what it was is there came a point in time that it would just take steps and it would stop. And there was a point in time when it just started really just making its presence known and started walking much heavier, just and when I would hear it walk, I would hear like limbs break. And they were fresh limbs. They weren't like dead limbs just falling randomly. And these limbs sounded like they were the size of Louisville sluggers. It was just snap, pop. And I was hearing like this small tree stumps that sounded like they were being pushed over. And I just immediately said, oh my God, there's somebody out here. I said, they're walking towards me, and then.
Now can you do me one favor though? And describe just a little bit about the difference between a live tree snap and a dead tree snap, and kind of just elaborate a little on that so people can understand when you say such a thing.
You can just go outside, for example, and just say, for example, go and find like a dead limb, and then like to say one that's maybe about 2 inches wide, and go out and like snap a dead limb, and then go out and get like a tree branches maybe about the same size and get one that's fresh. You'll notice that the sound when it snaps is actually much louder. Like because a rotten piece of wood, it's like it's dead. It has no life in it. And so they're like when it snaps, I mean, like a rotten piece of wood, for example, I mean, it just completely gives way. You know what I mean?
Right.
But like a tree branch that actually has life in it, when it's fresh, I mean, it just snaps. Like
Right.
snap.
So basically, there's a difference in sound, and so when you say that, you are actually saying that out of experience, and there's a difference in sound basically, and you detected that there was a difference in sound. All right.
Yeah, I mean, anybody can go out in the woods, and if you sit there and you go out like on a very windy day, you'll hear limbs fall and snap, and I mean, like
Right.
a rotten piece of wood, a squirrel can pretty much run across it, and it's like
Right.
it's just enough pressure on it that the limb will just fall to the ground. And I mean,
Right.
like you might hear the weight of the thing as it hits the ground, but you're not going to really hear like a loud snap or a loud pop.
Right.
And
So continue forward with the story, and also if you would kind of add in there, do you think that the tree snaps are signaling between each other, or are they between Squatch, or do you think maybe they are designed to intimidate you, or just kind of throw your thoughts in there as you tell the story?
The feeling that I was getting, it was more of an intimidation thing. I mean, like whatever it was, like I say, like when I heard it walking downhill, I mean, the steps became so much heavier. And there came a point in time, like when I thought this was a human being, I mean, the whole time this stuff was going on up until like I saw what I saw, I thought this was people. I did not think anything else other than that. And when I heard these steps, and then it was the thing, as it was snapping these branches, when it started stepping much heavier, it was making its presence known, as to say, I'm here. And these branches snapping, it was to scare me and most definitely intimidate me. I mean, like if in my opinion, if you were going to sneak up on somebody, in the woods, and you were just scaring them because you wanted them to leave the area, wouldn't you be quiet? You know what I mean? And you would just kind of walk up on them and say, boo, or, whatever. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I just felt like this person was just alerting me that, hey, I'm here. And I thought maybe, okay, well, this person's just trying to run me off. And I mean, at that age, I was getting scared enough to that point where I was just about ready to jump off the deer stand and just run to where my dad was,
Right.
And there was something that was just telling me, do not move. Do not move from this spot. Do not climb down. I mean, that's what the voice in my head was telling me. Okay, so this thing was a little bit about halfway towards me, what I call the walker, if you will. And I mean, around the time I had the idea to get down and climb and run, I immediately heard something in this brush that was behind me, and it was just this like where my uncle would go and blaze these trails with a bulldozer, it would be like a dirt trail. And so like a lot of the stuff that he would bulldoze would start growing on the opposite sides of the trail, so you'd have like a mixture of like these clove leaves, honeysuckle vines, and just different brush and stuff like that. I mean, it's almost like a perfect natural honey wand. I just immediately heard something that just sounded like something had slid. I mean, like I guess the thing that I could compare it to is like if you played baseball, when you slide to like one of the bases, you hear that sound. And I mean, like at that age, I didn't really have a very colorful language, but I'm starting to think, okay, what the hell is that? And I'm like, oh great, now somebody's behind me too. And well, I could actually hear what this person, what I thought was a person, I could hear it moving around in this little brush patch. And this position that this thing was in was no more than 20 feet away from me. That particular day, I was in kind of a Y-shaped tree. It wasn't like a very old tree, but I think it was probably about 2.5 to 3 feet wide. The base of the tree where it would have split up and formed the Y formation, I mean, it would have been about 1 foot over my head. So the stand was about 12 feet in the air. And I mean, like it was a really good stand in the way that I could have turned around and looked, but hey, you there?
Yeah, I'm there. I'm here.
Okay, you heard that click. Okay, so then I just did not want to turn around and look and see whatever it was. And then I'm starting thinking, okay, what is the intentions here? What's going on out here, you know? And I could hear this thing. It was just like moving in the brush. I mean, you could hear it. Like it was almost like someone that was like squatted down, and they're moving on their feet and they're moving closer towards me. And it would take these pauses where, in other words, you would kind of hear it moving along really slowly, and then it would take, like, in other words, I guess like in other words, it would make a further motion. In other words, it would move further down the brush patch and moving towards me. And the whole time that this is going on, the walker is still walking towards me. Okay, so then what I call the walker, it basically, I say it would have been about 45 or 50 yards away from me, maybe a little bit closer. And it was basically like there was a hill in front of it, so it would have been in the bottom of the hill on the other side. So if that hill would have not been there, I would have been able to see what I thought was a person. Okay, so then where it got weird, as the thing was, the person behind me, I thought, was moving through this brush. About the second or third time it did this, it started like shaking like the brush at me, like like, you know, not very violently, but like, in other words, like what you call like a flushing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I said, oh man. So this stuff went on for quite a few minutes. You know what I mean? And I don't really remember what I don't know what time it would have been or something like that. But around this time, it started lightening up. I mean, it was like, I guess, what you would call breaking dawn. I mean, like, all the shadows had gone from black to being transparent. And I mean, like, the sky was fairly blue. And I mean, you could see pretty well out there by the time all this stuff had concurred. And I'm like, by this time, I'm just like, okay, somebody out here is trying to ambush me. I'm like, are they trying to shoot me? Are they going to kill me? I felt like, I guess, kind of toyed with. Like, I felt like, in other words, you know, I'm just like a kid, you know, I'm thinking all of these things. I'm like, okay, it's this person trying to run me out of the tree, so I'll run this way and somebody's going to get me. I mean, I just felt like somebody was trying to get me, you know.
Right.
And not long after the flushing, I mean, it was just a few moments later, there was this big, huge oak tree in front of me, and on, like, the right side of it, I thought I saw something like black just kind of maneuver behind the tree really quick. In other words, I just saw like the brief motion of something. And I started looking and I started thinking, is that a shadow or what is that? But like, basically I saw this happen about 2 or 3 times. And I mean, I just came like where I was fixated on this spot because I'm trying to tell my mind, I'm like, is this a shadow or something else? And I'm thinking, is there another person over here behind this tree? And then, like, that's when, I guess, well, you could say the climax of this story begins happening. I see what I think is like a shoulder start peeping around the backside of this tree. And I notice that it's got just hair on it. That's just black hair. And that's when I see this head, like, basically tilt and just basically, you know, kind of looking at me. The head is, like, tilted. I guess to kind of give you a visual idea, it looked like somebody would have had their left arm kind of out where the shoulder was kind of pointing out, and like the left arm would have been like cradled into like the chest area, and somebody had their head tilted. But I immediately noticed that I could see this eyeball looking at me. And this thing was probably, I'd say, it was under 8 feet tall, but it was probably like way up in the 6 foot to almost 7 foot region. I just immediately noticed that it was taller than any human being that I had seen in person.
Right.
I mean, it was beyond like basketball player height, but it was not 8 feet.
Right.
And so I'm like looking at this, and I don't. It was almost like I became in like a trance state or mesmerized, and I just remember seeing this angry looking eyeball looking at me, and I'm like, my God, what is that? And I guess like the face that I was seeing, it was just this black looking eyeball. And I could see, like, you know, like how some primates kind of have, like, that deep-set wrinkle from, like, the corner of their eye that kind of goes down to the cheek. I could see about a center bridge of a head, the center brow of the head. It was like a cone-shaped looking head. And whatever it was just covered in hair. And when this started happening, I just realized that it was not people doing this, you know what I mean? And I mean, like, the fear factor just went through the roof at this point in time.
Right.
And I'm like, my God. I'm like, what is that? And I just became just so tranced by what and mesmerized by what I was seeing. What ended up snapping me out of it was the thing that was behind me. It actually started. It just sounded like it was trying to get through all this brush and stuff, and it was hung up or something. Like, in other words, it couldn't break through. But I mean, it was coming out of the bushes, and it was going to get me, and I just could not take it anymore. When I saw like the thing, like I took the safety off of the rifle whenever this thing was looking at me after a few seconds.
Right.
And I mean, I locked eyes with it. I mean, it might have been 10 or 15 seconds, but I took the safety off. And when I heard that thing trying to come through the brush, I mean, I just basically what ended up happening, I couldn't take it no more. I basically stood up really quick. I balanced myself on the back of that tree, and that's when I got a glimpse of. I never saw what it was. I could just see the brush moving, like if something was trying to come through it. And I had like the rifle right on that thing, and for some reason at the last second, I just ended up shooting a shot right in front of it. And when I shoot that shot off, I ended up hearing four things run away. The first one I heard ran away was something I didn't know was there that would have been behind the one behind me, and the one behind me hauled butt, and then there was two in front of me. All right, so when I turned around, basically what I see is, well, you know, like me not knowing what it was and me knowing what it is now, I saw a Sasquatch creature that was basically just it moved so quick, it was just running away. Okay, so what happened is, like, whenever I fired the shot off, I immediately turned in front of me, and I was holding the gun. I didn't like immediately point it, and I saw like the creature in front of me take off. And when that sucker took off, I mean, it like ran into a clearing. I mean, the lighting conditions, it was what I guess what I would call breaking dawn. It was light enough that when that thing walked into the open part of where it was standing, you know, where I could see the field and stuff, I got a really good look at it. And I mean, it took like these 5 or 6 long stride steps as it was running. I could see like the very back of the neck. I could tell it had a cone head. It was very girthy. I'd say it was probably about almost 4.5, maybe 5 feet wide. It was under 8 feet tall, but I believe that it was at least over 7. You could actually see like the hair on the body, and it kind of just had like what you call a wavy, what we call kind of a bedhead type kind of look. I mean, you could actually see different waves, like in other words, like where it had been laying down or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And basically, I ended up seeing like the bottom of its foot. It was this human-looking white foot.
Right.
And right before it ran into the woods, it basically came to like a brief field. It just paused long enough to kind of stop. It leaned a little bit to the right, and then it pushed off this right foot and just really pushed very sharply up, and it ran into the wood line. All right, so like the walker that was on its side, when they got about 20, 30 yards away from me, from there, you know, and I guess they would have been like, you know, in 40, 50 by this point in time. When they got quite a little distance away, they started calling like crows. Like, I mean, I don't want to sound like a dork, but like, caw, caw. It sounded like a person. It did not sound like a bird at all. And even if not knowing what this was, it just came off to me that this is some kind of, they're alerting whatever they are that I'm in this area. And I mean, like, here it is. It's like, you know, breaking dawn, and the wood sounded like Rice Krispies. It was snap, crackle, and pop of these things running through the woods everywhere. And like I said, there had been one there I never even knew was there. And, you know, the whole time that stuff was going on, I mean, like, my fear instinct was to get down and run. And I really feel, and like, you know, I always say that there's good and bad in these creatures, but I think if these things would have got their hands on me, I think they would have murdered me. I really do. I mean, it was a very threatening situation. I mean, like, and knowing what I know now, these creatures were basically trying to flush me out of the tree. And I mean, then what was their intention going to be with me once they got me down? I mean, they weren't going to give me a hug, you know?
Yeah.
They weren't just going to scare me, because if that was the case, I mean, look how many encounter stories you have where, like, okay, if they want you to get out of their area, they'll go and they might throw a stick at you, they might throw a rock at you, they're going to growl at you. These things were hunting me that day, and I felt like they knew I was young, and I felt like, to some degree, like they had taken advantage of me because I was young. They looked at me like, well, okay, out of the people coming here, this one has to be the weak link in the chain, you know?
Right.
And so when they ran away, I was just so scared. I was too scared. I mean, I couldn't hardly speak. I finally started gathering myself. I mean, I was probably just shivering and shaking. I still had like the feeling, do not get down. And I still felt like I was being watched. And I think there was one around that I just never saw, that never made its presence known. It took my dad about 5 minutes to show up. And when he finally did show up, I mean, I just remember climbing down the tree stand really quickly. And I just remember saying, Dad, Dad. I mean, I couldn't. I mean, I could barely get words out of my mouth. The only thing I could say to him, I said, there's people out here. I said, there's people out here, and they were trying to get me. And, you know, he was just kind of mad because he had to leave his spot. And, of course, he didn't believe me. He immediately says to me, there's nobody out here, you know.
Right.
And I told him, I said, look, I said, I want to get out of here right now. Because I felt like, as me and him were talking, I just felt like we were being watched. And so, I mean, he didn't have no problem, but he ended up taking me back to camp after this happened. He's like, he tells me as he's dropping me off in the trailer that we use for camp, he's like, are you sure you don't want to go out in the woods? I'm like, no, I don't want to go back out. And so he ended up leaving and going hunting back out in the woods with everybody else. But I promise you, as soon as he got out of the way, I went and I guarded the door for the rest of the day with my gun until like there was somebody there.
Right.
And
Now, like we were talking a little bit ago, after we had got cut off, and I called you back. I was telling you about whenever I used to film dog training clinics where people would bring their high dollar sheep herding dogs to this property. And my job was to film these things, document the training of the creatures, of the dogs, basically. They were very, very expensive dogs. And I observed the way that the leader would signal the dogs. They would signal the dogs with voice commands, arm commands, and all kinds of different commands that would make the dog go right, go left. And every movement of the dog was designed to drive the sheep in a certain direction, in a certain way. And it was actually a fairly complex system that was designed for sheep herding. Now, I'm saying when you describe this to me, it sounds like that there was a leader of the Sasquatch that was tree peeking on you that you was able to see, but the noises, the tree snaps, the footfalls, all that kind of stuff was designed to be noticeable because they are able to be very stealthy and non-noticeable in the woods. They can sneak up on you and you not know it.
I mean, there's no doubt about that.
Right.
They were making themselves known to me. I mean,
Right.
they were trying to scare me. And in other words, I mean, like, you know, like I was just saying a minute ago, they were almost positioned like military people. I mean, you had the one behind me. You had the one I didn't know was there that would have been probably about, you know, just a very few yards behind him, right in the tree line. I had the one in front of me that was about 35 yards away. And then you had the walker that I couldn't see that was basically on the other side of the bottom of a hill. And I mean, they would have gotten me, if I would just say, for example, if fear would have gotten the best of me and I would have jumped down and ran, I don't think I would be here talking to you right now on this phone. I really don't.
Right. Yeah.
I mean,
you know, typically, it would have been a deer that they would have been doing this to. So the sound of the stomping or the tree breaks and all that would have been designed to push the deer in a certain direction. And where you were in a tree, they were doing whatever they could to try to drive you and bring in the other group, the rest of the group, onto your position. And that's what it kind of seems like to me.
And you know, and like as silly as it sounds, I mean, I kind of thought Bigfoot when I got to camp and I kind of settled with myself. I started thinking, of course, Bigfoot and stuff like that. And you know, I started telling myself, I'm like, what did I see? And it just immediately I started thinking about catamounts, which were like what my grandparents talked about. And you got to think that I was actually not too far out of the way of being in a tree line. And the key word here is being tree line, and that's what they would talk about. These things coming to the tree line, and I was like, oh my God, you know. And I mean, I don't think I slept that night. I really don't. And you know, like the next day, everybody wanted to go out hunting. I didn't go. And we ended up leaving, I guess, about 11 or 12 o'clock, in the early afternoon. And I don't think I slept until, like, we were on the way home.
Right.
And, I mean, man, after that happened, I mean, like, I couldn't talk about it. I mean, I could have trusted some of my family members to have talked about that, and they would have believed me regardless. But it was just something I could not talk about. You know what I mean? I remember, like, when I was a preteen kid at that age, I was a very shy kid. I didn't talk a lot. You know what I mean? I had, like, one or two friends. But I wasn't, like, other than the company of my family, I wasn't a very talkative person. You know what I mean? I was kind of quiet anyway. So, like, they didn't notice any change in me because they just thought, well, I'm being myself. You know, I'm just kind of a quiet kid and whatnot anyway.
Right.
And for some reason, I just wanted to put it behind me. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to talk about it. And then I would have recurring nightmares from there on. And, like, the scenario in these nightmares would always be the same. I would always be running through the woods, and it's like I would be on my last breath, like I'm about to collapse. And I always had something chasing after me. And it's like I would wake up right before whatever it is would get me, you know?
Right.
And I would have dreams like that for years, man. And,
yeah.
And, like, it took me really a long time for that to kind of dim down within my soul, so to speak. You know what I mean?
Right.
And after that, I never went back to deer camp. I never wanted to go back out in the woods. And I just kind of chopped it up as, well, maybe I was out in the deep woods, which is why I saw these things. And I had other reasons for not wanting to talk about it. And, like, most of it was you didn't hear about these creatures being in the South. So I always said, okay, well, I guess I kind of had more of a negative view about it. I was like, if I tell someone about this, they're not going to believe me, because if I come out and say Bigfoot, they're going to say, well, this thing lives in California and Washington and Canada. It's not in the South, But I will say this, when I did see Boggy Creek after that, it went from being a comedy to being a real horror movie for me, you know what I mean?
Right, yeah.
I wasn't laughing when I watched it.
Right.